I'm Archbishop Joseph Kurtz, and I'm pleased to invite you to view a special presentation for Archdiocese Today on this month in September of Marriage and Family Month. You'll be viewing the second presentation that was given at a special seminar by Dr. Scott Stanley, who is a research director for the Research Department of Marriage and Family at the University of Colorado. I thank you for your viewing this fine presentation.
Good morning. It's really great to be here, and I want to thank Archbishop Kurtz and Sal and Brian. I am just very pleased. I wanted to start with a quick confession. This will be very brief. I am not a Catholic, so generally I've found Catholic audiences very forgiving of that fact, but I feel like you should know I'm a Presbyterian. I am definitely a believer and have a lot of faith and believe in marriage. I also spend a lot of time doing research, so this will be a pretty conceptual, somewhat researchy, but much more applied kind of talk related to the research. And I think you'll see as we talk, there's a lot of things that we're doing right now and others are doing in terms of research about marriage, and in particular what I'm going to focus on today, commitment formation, that's very relevant to what a lot of you do and a lot of what's going on with young people these days. Now, I wear a lot of hats in life, so I do the research professor thing, and I'll be much more sort of in the professor mode today. As Brian mentioned, we develop a lot of materials based on the research for couples, so there's the PrEP curricula, which is not Prepare, by the way. That's a more of assessment instrument, somewhat like Focus. We also do a lot of research on premarital education and on risk factors and all these kinds of things. I'm not so focused on that talk today, but I certainly, if there's a vehicle that you all have here or that Sal would want to send any articles to you, I could certainly send you some of the different journal articles and some of those themes that I'm not talking so much about today, if that's something that seemed to be not too much of a hassle for Sal to do. And that assumes he has your email addresses. So what I'm really going to focus on is a talk that's very much geared now to what I call the formation of commitment. And it's going to touch a lot on various trends in relationship development these days. Particularly, we'll talk some about research on cohabitation. And I think the research on cohabitation is particularly valuable because it provides a great window for how young people are thinking these days and what they're thinking is going to work or not work so well for them. So you'll see what I do with that as we go on. So the thing I want to start with is just the point that young people are unsure about marriage. Archbishop Kurtz commented about this in terms of the fear that young people have these days. And I think about it this way. There's a lot of evidence that they really want love, they want commitment, they want lifelong love, but they have not a great sense that it's very possible. This is the first generation which has seen the full gamut of both a lot of divorce, but also a lot of marriage not happening in the first place. And in some ways, divorce isn't really even the most interesting story right now. A bigger, really important story is just the increasing shyness, if you will, about marriage, where people are putting it off further and further, and many important things are happening outside the context of marriage now. As was also mentioned earlier today, and which many of you are very acquainted with, we live in a culture now where marriage and childbearing, child rearing are becoming pretty divorced from each other. I mean, there's a really great divorce if you want to think about a big divorce going on in the culture. And if you talk increasingly with young people, especially if you get outside sort of the middle and upper middle class kind of range, where a lot of what you might typically think about, sort of the traditional sequence of trying to choose a good partner, get married, have children, that still lives pretty well there. Outside that range, it's pretty obliterated. and the connection between marriage and children is simply really hardly there anymore in American culture. Now, some symptoms of the loss of marriage. One is that people are marrying later and later and later, and I'll show you a graph that depicts that in a second. And some of what I think is going on is they're really waiting later and later to marry because they're sort of developing themselves entirely before they come into marriage so that they can self-insure, if you will, so they can protect themselves. So there's such an emphasis now on one's own financial development and vocational development, in part because that's kind of where we're at with the culture and society and opportunity. But part of that, I think, is actual a response to anxiety and disbelief in confidence in marriage. So that essentially what you see young people doing now is they're self-insuring. Where it used to be people would marry younger, and sometimes people married too young and struggled because of that. And of course, some people married really young and have done great in life. But that historically, marrying at 18, at least for the last several decades, has been a whopping risk factor of not doing well in marriage. Despite the number of couples we may know who did that and it turned out fine, there's many more couples where they did that and it didn't turn out fine. But now you have people really marrying at 27, 28, 26, etc. And a lot of that's in response to this anxiety about marriage. And while not trained in Catholic theology, I'm very interested actually in your theology of marriage. And I've said publicly, and I'll do so again, I tend to think it's richer and deeper and more interesting and has a lot of great things in it compared to Protestant theology on marriage. And one of the ideas that you have that I'm very intrigued by is the idea of marriage as a spiritual vocation. So here's just a kind of bit of a play on words here, but you see with young people these days, they don't trust that vocation. They're really trusting their own vocation, career, work, etc., because they're protecting themselves. Here's a good example. This is a report you can find on the web if you just like bits of data that sort of are nicely summarized. This came out 2 years ago by William Galston. It's a report called The Changing 20s. You can download it on the web. And he shows here essentially by the age, so going back to 1970 versus up to 2005, the percentage of people that have never been married yet by age 25. And you can see how dramatic that increase has been. One thing I'll comment real quickly on, and then I'll buzz on, because it's so related to everything else I'm going to talk about here in this time. I once was in a meeting where David Papineau, who was actually, along with Barbara Defoe Whitehead, the co-leader of the National Marriage Project, which is now headed up by a gentleman named Brad Wilcox, who, by the way, is one of a really prominent sociologist who is a Catholic, by the way. You could have had him. He's a very good guy. But I was in a meeting once, and David Papineau, another sociologist, he made this observation. It was kind of a think tank, sort of policy-oriented kind of meeting. He said, now think about this. You know, with health and nutrition and all, we have young people maturing sexually. Now, not maturing sexually, where their bodies can have sex and they can reproduce children by age 13 or so. Okay, 13, 14, whatever. Then on the other end, you have people marrying later and later and later, like 26, 27, 28. It just keeps going higher. And he said, I mean, this is like one of those times where somebody says something that's totally obvious, but you just sort of didn't really take it in that way so clearly before. He said, look, that means we have this like 13, 14-year period now where people essentially are practicing how not to be monogamous. And another way that I've thought about it in terms of what happens in American culture now is what you see going on during those years are people actually retain a strong belief and desire in marriage. That's very clear. But what's happening during those years is people are doing many things that put that goal further and further out of reach for more people in terms of things that have happened that make it less and less likely that it'll ever be something that they can accomplish. And we'll talk about some of those things. One of the signs of the loss of confidence in marriage is seeking the perfect love. And I actually think this is part of what this drive for the soulmate is about. Papineau and Whitehead they used to do these yearly reports that were just terrific, and they did one in 2001 called Who Wants to Marry a Soulmate? And they did a national survey and found of young adults in America, 94% said that first and foremost when you marry, you want to find your soulmate. That's really the secret. Now, very interesting, I thought, as somebody with more of a religious background, which isn't so typical in social science, but they also found that it was only like 34 or 36, it was mid-30s, only 34% or so said that when you pick a mate, they needed to share your religious beliefs. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? You know, what you really need to find is your soulmate, but they don't actually have to share the major beliefs at the root of your sense of your soul. Which tells you something about what's really in this concept of soulmate. And I think there's some characterizations of the idea of soulmate that are perfectly fine and are good theology and good psychology. But I don't think that's mostly what young people are talking about when they say that. What I think they're really talking about is the perfect lover who would never reject me and who's so perfectly tuned to me that everything will work out fine. So if I can just find that one person, we're going to be good. We're going to be fine. The problem, of course, with the strong version of that belief is that most marriages get hard at some point. Many marriages get hard at many points where it's kind of some work and it's some real investment and some real sacrifice. And in those times when marriage is more difficult and when you really kind of have to gut it through at times and really work through something, it's pretty easy if you have a strong belief in soulmate to think, I picked the wrong one. You must not be my soulmate because she wouldn't talk to me like that. You know, she wouldn't challenge me like that. He wouldn't hassle me in that way, so I must have picked the wrong one. So I better leave you because somewhere in the world there's my soulmate, and if I don't leave you, I'm depriving that person of my presence. Okay? So, you know, it's like this cosmic spiritual disaster happening. Another great example of the sort of anxiety about marriage is the growth of cohabitation, and I'll say probably more about that empirically than anything else. But one of the things that you see with cohabitation is what it essentially does is it really blurs the edges around what a relationship is. So I like to think of it this way. If you meet somebody at a party, or let's say a couple at a party or a social or something for the first time, and they tell you that they're married. Maybe they tell you they're married so many years. Or they say, well, that's my spouse over there. You'll have to meet her, whatever. Somebody tells you they're married. You don't know, like, if it's a happy marriage, a sad marriage, conflicted marriage. You don't know how many kids they have. But you know something pretty important about that person and about that couple. If somebody walks up to you and says, oh, yeah, I'm living with my girlfriend. Or, yeah, that's, you know, we've been living together for a year or so. You know almost nothing about them, except that they share a single address. It's relatively non-informative about commitment, about plans. It's very ambiguous. In fact, one researcher calls it an ambiguous commitment. And that's part of why it's attractive, is that it's ambiguous. Come back to that in a minute. But here's one of the big deals about, a lot of times we think about marriage and divorce. In some ways, a much bigger story is unfolding in the last 4 decades, which is the number of children not married or not born not to married couples. So that's a big story. But the sub-story within that that's really fascinating is the number of children who, increasingly the number of children who are born to cohabiting and not married parents. Now that would have less social significance or consequence, except for the fact that the odds of a married couple being together at age 2 of that child they're having together are 6 times greater than the odds of the cohabiting couple. Because coming back to what I said, cohabiting is relatively non-informative with regard to commitment. But one of the things that is true, and this is part of what's attractive about cohabiting to a lot of young couples, is cohabiting couples compared to dating couples, you know, they're living together, they're sleeping together, they're having a lot of sex, and you know how babies come, right? I mean, babies, they happen from sex. So with more sex comes more odds of babies. So you have a lot of babies now increasingly born in what's essentially a low commitment context, where there's not much clarified about the future between this couple. And then the odds have gone greatly down now that that child's going to be raised by those 2 parents, which other social observers have commented, and I think this is a really important point to struggle with, that we tend to think a lot about the divide economically these days in terms of the super rich and those in poor and all. And that's always been an issue. It's always going to be an issue. And you could have various views in terms of how you'd want to address that societally or what you think should happen related to that. But the really more powerful divide that's opening up right now in terms of the opportunities for children is between the children that are being raised by their parents, their two biological parents or adoptive parents, versus the children that are not being raised in terms of by their parents, which again is nothing to take away from the terrific job that a lot of single parents are doing, or that a lot of divorced parents are doing, or a lot of parents that never got married are doing. But it's just become very clear in social science that in terms of the odds of success in lots of different ways in life just go greatly up when a child is raised by their two committed biological parents. And we're drifting strongly away from that as a society. I'll just make this point without commenting on it, except to just say there's a lot of things related to cohabitation and patterns there that also have a lot of linkages to socioeconomic differences and income differences and racial differences and subcultural differences. So the story is not sort of as simple as it can sound like. There's some dynamics that I'm going to talk about that I think are true across the board, but just in terms of patterns, likelihood of marriage, likelihood of divorce, likelihood of cohabitation, there are some important differences in terms of race and income. Now, one of the really important and interesting beliefs that we have now in society that's a sign, again, of this anxiety about marriage and about commitment in marriage is the belief that, and this could be the most strongly believed thing, the strongest belief by young people now about the number one thing they can do to increase their odds of doing well in marriage is to live together before marriage. I don't know what would be rated higher by them. I guess maybe the soulmate thing might be, but it's a really strong belief in this, and I'm going to talk about from a research perspective that's just, there's no real evidence of that, but it's a very strong belief. And interestingly enough, Archbishop Kurtz mentioned before this thing about, kids, they don't want to tell you this, but that they are listening more to their parents or more willing to listen to their parents than we sometimes think. Very interestingly, we found in this survey data in Oklahoma from 2001, I forget the percentage of this, I should go dig this up, but not only did the young people believe that this was a great way to prepare for marriage, was to cohabit first, their parents believed. The parents of young children thought that that was a really important step before you would marry somebody. So it's not like they were going to hear something different from their parents or any cautions from their parents. Their parents believed the same thing. And that can only be more true as time goes on. Now, in the midst of pessimism, I'll just make a brief point about this, about marriage. I really love the point about the Berlin Wall that Archbishop mentioned earlier, because I grew up in that generation too, and you're just thinking that's never coming down. That's never going to change. When could something that massive and this divide, ever change? And sometimes there's revivals. Sometimes there's things that change in amazing ways that are beyond what we could have thought or imagined would have happened. And one of the things that I think is hopeful about marriage, when I really think from a social science perspective, many things are not hopeful about marriage, is contained in this core passage in Scripture about marriage, Genesis 2:24-25. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. The man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. This idea, this latter sentence here, of being naked and feeling no shame, what I think is very powerful about that is it speaks to this desire that's created within all of us to be fully known and fully accepted, to have a relationship at that level of acceptance and emotional safety. I think people want that as much as they ever wanted that. Most people want that in marriage. The problem isn't that belief and that desire. The problem is their confidence in that as a vehicle to make it happen. And that's where they need the help. They don't really need to be convinced about lifelong love and commitment in marriage. They just don't think it can happen, or they're less likely to think it can happen. Now, some foundational points about commitment, because I'm going to talk a lot about commitment and commitment formation in the rest of my time. One of the things you can think about when you think about commitment is it's about making the choice to give up other choices. So anytime you think about somebody making a commitment to something important in life, there's some choice point that's in front of them. There's some alternatives, there's some options, and they're going to choose among those options, and that's one of the essential natures of commitment, is making that choice. Which also means, or that's also an insight as to why commitment is such a dicey thing in American culture at this point, because if anything, what we're really steeped in at this point in our culture is to not give up any options, not give up any choice. And that's not the path of the committed life. We cannot really have the committed life without choosing among some of the options and being willing to give some up. So in terms of marriage, it's fundamentally about choosing something, well, in this case, choosing someone for the future. Now, two other terms that will be really important as I roll through a number of pieces now is another way, and this is how I think of it as a researcher in terms of what we're very often measuring, is that you can measure commitment more in terms of personal dedication, and this is what we most often think about when we think about commitment. So this is commitment in this way. You know, Mary is really dedicated to that project. She's really into that ministry. She's really devoted to that project at church or whatever. It speaks to this high intrinsic motivation, this identification with the goal, the willingness to sacrifice for it. And that's what you see a lot of the commitment that propels the best marriages is dedication. Now, there's another kind of commitment that's very important that we all recognize and feel in life, which is more characterized by the word constraint. And this is more commitment in terms of the have to than the want to. So you could reflect it in a statement like this. Well, Joe committed to serve on that committee. Notice committee, committed, there's something about that. He can't back out now. You know, it conveys the sense that because he's taken these steps, he's started to move down this path, it's not so easy just to move up and back up and pick a different path now. Now, if you think about this related to marriage, in terms of high-quality marriages, they're going to be characterized by lasting, sort of thriving dedication between partners. Every marriage, especially over time and more through growth and changes, also has a lot of constraint commitment. They might vary some from one marriage to another in terms of how much constraint. And the interesting thing about constraint is this. It's not so much really negative or positive or whatever. As a psychologist, I have to define it negatively to get to the answer, which is this. What are the things that keep somebody in a marriage that they might want to leave? That's the constraint kind of question. But in a healthy marriage that's thriving and growing over time, where people are dedicated to each other, they're just as constrained as any other couple. It's just they don't think about the constraints because they're enjoying the union. They're really, when dedication is high, people don't really notice constraint. It's when the dedication wanes a bit. Some of you have noticed this in terms of choice of vocation, whether that's spiritual or non-spiritual, or a career, a pathway in life, or to a person, or whatever. We all experience this, that at times the dedication wanes, and then you're sort of more aware, well, what would it cost me to leave? So hang on to that concept of constraint. We're going to do a fair amount with it as we go forward. Overall, why commitment is so crucial in so many places in life, like romantic relationships and marriage especially, and education and personal care, exercise, health, all these things, is best explained by a little comment about this dog. Now, this is my dog, Odie. Odie is now, he's about to be 9. Next month he will be 9 years old. But this is a picture that I took the very first day we brought him home when he was a little 4-pound fluff ball. He's now a giant 17-pound behemoth that terrorizes the neighborhood, as you can well imagine. He's still actually nearly as cute. But here, think about this little puppy. Now, this is an illustration I often use with younger folks and couples in general, but especially people that are sort of near the time of sort of transition or early marriage or moving toward marriage. And there's a lot of different lessons I can give. I've actually given a little bit of a talk called The Theology of the Puppy before, but that's a whole nother talk. But this one has a very simple point, and it speaks to why commitment's so important. And I like to point out to people, unless you're a cat person, and if you are, you can squint and sort of imagine Odie as a cat. He's sort of dual purpose. When you look at that little face, unless you're just not an animal person and just not a dog person, what's your emotional reaction? Aww. Yeah, exactly. You just want to take him home. You just want, you just want to take this little guy home. And here's the point I often make with couples that I want them to notice. And the point is simple. You fall in love with the front end of the puppy. Okay? But every puppy has a back end. And if you think about this, this is kind of like one of these little profound things that's sort of really obvious. But a lot of relationships with new puppies, whatever, don't work out because it's not because of the front end. It's not cute today. Some dogs maybe later aren't so cute. But generally, it's not that the cuteness quit working. It's that there's a problem with the back end. And the back end's the tricky part about regulating time and place. And every marriage has the back end work and the front end joy. And why commitment is so crucial is because it's not all front end. Okay? So commitment's pretty crucial. Now, why does commitment develop? I've been thinking a lot about this, actually for about 15 years, but in some ways a lot more accelerated thought I've put into this in the last year or so around a couple of key themes. But the basic idea I've thought about for a long time is if you think about, this is just thinking psychologically here, not spiritually or legally or whatever, is you have two people that become attracted somehow. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that can happen, and I don't think researchers perfectly in any way understand attraction, which is great because it's kind of the real mysterious sort of part of love. But something happens that most all of us can relate to, and certainly all couples that have progressed at some point in terms of commitment, or not progressed actually, can relate to this stage where you're really in love with this person. The romantic love is pretty intense, and there's this emotional attachment that's growing. But what's happened that causes anxiety is the emotional attachment is out. It's leaped ahead of where the commitment is to the relationship. So I'm really attached to you, and I know now that it's going to hurt a lot if we break up. And since we have not clarified any commitment, I'm feeling anxious. So it's a kind of attachment anxiety, not so much the way we think about it with child development, but much more in terms of emotional connection between two people. And commitment really develops to secure the attachment. It sort of says, you can count on me being here, and I'm counting on you to be here, and we're moving into the future together. And historically, that culminates in an I do, followed by an I will, and then we face the problems and issues of life together with that foundation. Now, attachment can lead to commitment, and attachment sort of cries out for commitment, but they're not the same. And it's commitment that really secures attachment. Attachment by itself doesn't necessarily lead to that security. Now, here's a really important sort of bigger picture perspective point. I think because of divorce, because of non-marriage, because of the number of couples not forming well or falling apart, the number of children decreasingly that will be raised in a sense of security in terms of their parents' committed relationship, I think, and this is something researchers could not easily demonstrate, but every researcher I know who I've shared this idea with from all kinds of different backgrounds and stripes is pretty okay with this idea. And the idea is this. We have to be producing, now I am talking about attachment insecurities among children, we have to be producing people with more deep, long-term attachment insecurities by the time they hit young adulthood than ever before. I don't see how it could be otherwise because of the way things are happening now in terms of the way children come into the world and the way children are raised these days. And there's really good evidence, I mean a very large literature now that shows that emotional attachment insecurities related to the parents as children have pretty big ramifications for emotional insecurities people bring into their adult romantic relationships. And so if you think about this, in some ways, we have more insecurities about attachment in this youngest generation than now we've probably ever had before. At the same time, we have less confidence than ever before in committed love. So the very thing that's so crucial for securing attachment, for conveying between two people that we're secure, you can count on me, I can count on you, we have a society that doesn't help people form that now, as people more than ever before need that to be formed. And that's a train wreck. Now, so in some ways, this is a whole play on words I can get into, but I'll just comment briefly. We have a lot of marriages now, even when couples get to marriage, that are formed much more by a maybe I do commitment than a really clear, unequivocal I do and I will. Now, a few comments about a crisis in commitment, and then I want to talk about cohabitation and talk about a transition and risk model. One of the things that's causing or related to this crisis in commitment is we have a society that have just more and more options all the time. I mean, just a very simple example of this. Just think of the last time that you chose a new cell phone. I mean, the number of options you had, the number of things you needed to choose. And there's all the issues about the plan, and there's the issues about the equipment. And do I want Android? Do I want iPhone? Do I want just a basic phone? All of these things. Social psychological research is becoming very clear. When people have more and more options, they have trouble choosing anything. Okay? In fact, you look at this research and you wonder how Baskin and Robbins ever made it in terms of their first store. And I don't know if this is true or apocryphal, but it's an interesting comment I read somewhere, and it sounded authoritative. But that when they first opened up and they had 31 flavors, a lot of people would just come in and stand there perplexed, and then they would order chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry. Okay, because it's like I can't deal with all the rest of this yet, but I know what those three things are, and I can choose between them. Now, eventually, it caught on, but this is a problem for people. Another issue, and I think this is something I've been thinking a lot about. Cohabitation, just sort of the preeminent example of this. But if you watch what young people are doing now in terms of romantic relationships, they're pretty motivated to not have it be clear what they're doing. Okay? And I'll give you the strongest form of this. If you think about, now I'm 54. When I was a kid in high school, was early 70s. Back then, you still had very prominent forms of practicing earlier stages of commitment leading up to marriage. You had going steady. You had girls wearing guys' class rings. I think friendship rings were still somewhat around. Probably in an era before that, if you get to college, you had pinned and different kinds of things. But think about this. Most of that is obliterated from the culture now. Just hardly exists or doesn't exist. And what that means, I think, is as a society, we've gotten away from all these kinds of things culturally that used to help people develop a sense of what it meant to be committed to somebody in romantic love. And all these kind of places of sort of practicing it and conveying to others that we're a couple. Interestingly, I think for about 10, 20 years now, there's sort of been nothing to replace any of that. The interesting thing we're starting to watch carefully now, and I don't know how it's really going to play out long term, but if you look at things like MySpace and Facebook, people can denote now whether they're in a relationship. And of course, the other person has to agree to be denoted if they're going to, make the name clear. And that's an interesting thing because there's sort of this reemergence of a way for a young couple to declare to other people that we're a couple when most of the trends have been toward ambiguity. And I think the ambiguity is motivated, that the ambiguity really resides in many things, but partly a very simplistic idea which goes like this. If it's never been that clear that the relationship really started, it's not going to hurt so much when it ends, which I don't think is true. But I think that's the sort of fuzzy psychological bargain that people are making. Let's not push it really to be all that clear because that starts to get really scary and threatening that we're going to lose something. So we just won't push that. If you add these sort of insecurities about attachment to it, you have people that are really anxious attached. They don't want to push because they're afraid to drive the other person away. You have people that are increasingly avoidant attached who are really trying to get, not to make any commitments, not to get locked down. And what's in it, ambiguity for them, is they don't have to declare themselves. So you have a lot of relationships now that get very far along where the two people may not even remotely be on the same page about commitment or where the future of the relationship is headed, and they don't find that out until fairly deep in a fairly painful way. Lastly, and I already made this point, just relationships cast adrift. All these steps and stages that used to exist that sort of help people progress in committed love up until and then into marriage, either with a particular person or just sort of, well, this one's not working out, really don't exist so much now. And there's real interesting consequences to that. In part, if you think about when the steps and stages existed, it was very hard for two people to be on a different page. Okay? If we're saying to other people that we're going steady, that's a public declaration of commitment. And what the public declaration of commitments required is some sense of understanding reality together. Without those mechanisms now, you have great mismatches in level of commitment, very often between two people in romantic love. And the one that's more committed doesn't know the other one's less committed because there's nothing culturally that's sort of fleshing that out. There's nothing requiring that person to step up. Now, one of my favorite phrases from a lot of research we've done is this idea of sliding versus deciding. And it comes from a line of research on premarital cohabitation. So let me just go through the facts here pretty quickly, and then I want to get to this conceptual kind of model of transition and risk, and you'll see a lot of implications for it in terms of ministry and issues with young people. As I mentioned earlier, young people, among the beliefs they have that are not true is this one. If we live together before marriage, it'll improve our odds of doing well in marriage. Generally, there's been very few studies that even remotely support that, and many, many studies for 4 decades or so that show the opposite, that living together prior to marriage is associated with greater risk, not less risk, and also associated with lower satisfaction in marriage, poor communication, more conflict, all kinds of things. So it's one of these areas where there's a great disconnect between what people believe, especially what young people believe, and what's actually true from the standpoint of social science. Now, this panel, I can post these notes, and so I'm just leaving this one there in a little more detail with some references, so I won't go through that. But there's 3 explanations for the cohabitation effect, and then I'm going to really focus on the third one to make points about transition and risk. One is, and these are all true, I think there's evidence, a lot of evidence for all 3 of these. One is that the risk for living together prior to marriage is elevated because not of living together prior to marriage, but because of the people that choose to live together prior to marriage versus the people that don't. So part of this risk in social science, we call this the selection effect. That there's things that put people already at greater risk for not doing well in marriage that also makes it more likely that they'll cohabit or that they'll cohabit with more people before marriage. So for example, just a very simple one, if my parents had divorced, I statistically would be much more likely as a young person to live together before marriage, or even to maybe live together with several people before marriage. If I come more from poverty, I'm more likely to live together with a number of people before trying to settle down in commitment. So there's things like that, that those things are also related to greater risk in marriage. So that's the idea of a selection effect. Now, we're doing a really large study on cohabitation at this point, funded by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And we're following around 1,300 people in the age of 18 to 34 who are in serious relationships. And this data here just fits a lot of other things that we see in the literature on cohabitation. Those who are more likely to cohabit or more likely to cohabit with more people, they tend to be older, have less education, more likely to already have children from a prior partner, more likely to have had more sexual partners, are more likely to have already to have divorced parents, experienced more conflict between the adults in their home growing up, have more favorable attitudes towards divorce and less favorable attitudes towards marriage, and are less religious. So these things are already true of the people more likely to take that path, and these are things that also put people at greater risk. So that's what we call the selection effect. And the selection effect implies that it's not so much cohabitation that's elevating the risk, it's that people that are more at risk are more likely to cohabit. So here's a really important point just scientifically. There's a lot of studies that show that the selection stuff accounts for some chunk of the risk of cohabiting prior to marriage. But there's also a lot of studies, you'll see in the bottom part of that list there, that show that you can control for all these other variables, all these kinds of selection characteristics, and still measure risk associated with cohabiting greater to marriage, which suggests there's something else involved. And the two best candidates for understanding what else is involved, one is what cohabitation does causally to a person. And there's some really great research. It's a little older now. It needs to be replicated in this era. But Axon and Thornton and Axon and Barber published studies in the 90s that showed the more people cohabit before marriage, and that means either cohabit longer with one person or especially cohabit with a number of people, the more sort of cohabitingness people do before they eventually settle into marriage, the more you can track over time an erosion of their beliefs and values in marriage and childbearing and childrearing. So there's actually some evidence that the practice of cohabitation erodes the sense that marriage is special or that raising a family is something that's worth doing in life. And that fits a lot of what a psychologist would say, because when people behave in certain ways consistently, not only does our behavior come from our beliefs and values will start to conform to our behavior. So the more we are engaging in a certain practice, the more our beliefs are going to come around to sort of endorse that practice because, well, I'm doing it, I must believe it's okay. And in this case, you can see that erosion. Now, my favorite theory and candidate for what's going on with this risk here that still seems to show up in studies is it's about cohabitation creating inertia that makes it harder to break up. Now, inertia is the property in physics that speaks to a particular object. Let's say there was a bowling ball on this table up here. Inertia speaks to how much energy it would take for me to start that ball moving a particular direction, or if it's already moving, shift its trajectory from going this way to this way. That's what inertia is about. It's moving something to do what other than what it's already doing. And here's the theory, and I'll tell you briefly how I got to it, but the theory is this. What young people don't get at all about cohabitation is this, especially cohabitation sharing a single address. It's the number one fact. They do not see it until you point it out to them, and then they can see it pretty clearly, is this. It's harder to break up with somebody you're living with sharing a single address than if you're dating, everything else being equal. It's just harder to break up. There's more to unravel. Somebody has to move out. Somebody's going to have to get a new place to live. If they were both sort of barely making it, affording that place, both are going to have to get a new place to live. There's some effort to end this relationship. Now, there's effort to ending a dating relationship too, but not nearly as much. Nobody has to move out. Hopefully, there's a discussion as opposed to a text message, right? But you know, it's not as big of a deal to end this, and this is what young people don't see. Now, here's the finding that led me to this, and I'm giving it to you visually, but I'll put it in words. We did a national sample of married people in 1996, and I had a finding from that that's led to now 15 years of research and thought about commitment formation, about cohabitation that we're really pursuing very vigorously at this point. And the finding was this. If you looked at the women in terms of how dedicated they were to their husband based on whether they cohabited or not prior to marriage, so that's the two red bars here, this is not a statistically significant difference between these two bars for the women. Okay? Conversely, if you looked at the dedication level of men to their wives based on whether they had lived with their wives prior to marriage, what we found is that the men who had not lived with their wives prior to marriage scored substantially higher on their level of dedication to their wives than the men who had lived with their wives before marriage. Now, by the way, whenever you're talking to a researcher, everything's on average. There's lots of exceptions to any kind of research finding. It's always interesting when I'm talking about these things with especially young female women's magazines writers, and you can tell when you just stepped on the thing that's starting to make them wonder about their own relationship. Oh, wait a minute, how can that be? You know, tell me more. I mean, they get kind of anxious. It's sort of interesting. So I started thinking about this, and I had essentially this idea came to me, keeping in mind this idea of the constraint side of commitment. Okay, come back to constraint for a second, because it occurred to me, gee, I think I understand this. Some of those guys married somebody they would never have married if they hadn't been living with them. Because it wasn't that I thought that they were less dedicated because of something that had happened in their marriage. What the insight was this, and there's a lot of research now that really supports this being part of what's in the mix. I thought they were never as dedicated to begin with. What happened is some of them got trapped by cohabiting. And if they hadn't been cohabiting, they would never have gotten to the altar, and they would have married somebody else. Okay? That was the key insight. Does that mean all men in that group? By no means. A lot of men in that group are just as dedicated, if not more dedicated, than men who didn't live together before marriage. But it was the subgroup in there I was very interested in. So that's the idea of inertia. Now notice inertia makes a very interesting and straightforward prediction. There's a lot of predictions to it that we're testing, but this one's really pretty powerful. If you're already engaged before you start living together, you might not be at as much greater risk from cohabiting as the person who's not engaged, because engagement means we've already mutually and publicly settled this question. At least with regard to this risk and how I framed it, if we're already engaged and I end up marrying this person, it's not because we were living together, because we had already determined that before we lived together. So this is a social science prediction. I'm not making a theological point. I'm just saying that group should be at lower risk. And we find that in virtually every place where we can measure it. Every place where we have the data on whether they were engaged or not, or clearly mutually planning marriage before they started living together, we find essentially this. Those who had really clarified that question are not at greater risk from living together prior to marriage. They look like the people that waited till marriage to live together. Everybody with me on that? Where the risk seems to be loaded, and again, there's exceptions within all these groups, but the group that's the highest risk are the people that start living together before they've clarified the answer to that question. Because again, I think that group contains the people who get trapped, who get stuck kind of by cohabitation. Now, I want to make a quick point here. I won't belabor this because I want to get on to a few slides before we do a few questions and answers at this point. And the point is this. I'm talking at the moment about good social science. I'm not talking about theology. So if I think about my sons and what I would hope for them to do, I would hope they don't live together before marriage. If I just have my social science hat on, I'm going to believe, well, I at least hope they're engaged before they ever cohabit, if they're going to cohabit. I would rather they wait theologically all the way till marriage. But I'm going to be especially freaked out and worried if they're starting to move in with somebody and they've not even clarified this big question about the future, because I know that group's at the highest risk. Now, some thoughts on what selection may not explain. Now, here's a very interesting finding that was like an epiphany for me in all kinds of things related to the formation of commitment. Manning and Smock are a couple of sociologists that have done a lot of good work in the area of cohabitation. And in a qualitative study they did on cohabitation, they found this. Very few couples could talk about time where, the cohabiting couples, where they deliberated, talked about it, thought about it, and decided what they were doing about cohabiting. More than half of the couples they interviewed who were cohabiting said they more or less just slid into it. So I was over there 4 nights a week, and then 5 nights a week. I left the toothbrush there, started leaving some clothes there. One day my lease was up or my roommate kicked me out and we just, we were living together. It's not like we sat down and talked about it and thought about it and what does this mean for me and what does this mean for you. They slide into it, okay? Which is in contrast to commitment, which is making a decision. Commitment's about deciding. Now, let me explain this carefully because I'm going to do something with these different panels. So here's a low-risk sequence in terms of getting into a committed love relationship. First off, I get information. Is this a safe relationship? Is this a safe person to be with? Is there compatibility? Is there a fit? Do we share important values and beliefs in life? Do we like to do the same kind of things? Do we both want to have kids? How many of you see the kids that are years into marriage or maybe a couple years in and they have the discussion they never had before about who wants a family? Well, I want 7 kids. Well, I didn't really want any. That's a pretty big, not fitting together. Is there a commitment and is it mutual? So I get this information and then I make a decision. I'm choosing. I'm choosing to give up other options because that's what commitment is. And then I'm going through a transition. Now, traditionally, I get this information, I've chosen carefully, and we're down here and we get married. Now, just to talk more generally here for a second, let's think about all the kinds of romantic relationship transitions people make now, and I'll make a key point about all of them before I get to the next slide, which is the most important of every one I'm going to show you. But you can think about people in terms of when do they have sexual contact, or when do they start getting sexual, or what way, or when do they get sexual, sort of at this level or this level. When do they start sort of getting connected biologically? I've written a lot about this on my blog lately, especially thinking about oxytocin and things that are different about women than men that I think really affect the dynamics here. I won't get into that right now. Cohabitation, that's a transition. Having a child, huge transition. Here's the key point I want you to get before I leave this slide. All of these transitions, maybe not all the time for everybody in some measurable way as a social scientist, but all of these transitions are either by definition or very likely or very possibly going to be life-altering in some way. Okay? And what I mean by this is I don't have, this last box is really talking about constraints. I don't have the same options I had before I went through that transition, whatever transition it is we're talking about in that box. Everybody with me on that? Okay? So whatever else happens in this model, I'm saying that the constraint stuff is increasing after that box, that these transitions are potentially life-altering. Here's the way we mostly do relationships in America now leading up to marriage. We slide through the transition. We get the constraints increasing. I don't have as many options as I used to have, and now I get information about whether that was a good thing to do. Do you see how out of place the information group box is there? I mean, I'm finding out whether that was a good idea way after I can undo that, whatever that is. Here I am. I have slid through this transition, and now I'm finding out that maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe they weren't thinking the same as me about commitment, etc. And that's a high-risk sequence. And you can combine that with speed, and you see a lot of what goes wrong for young people these days. So they slide into something that's potentially life-altering. After the slide, there's less options. They get the information after that. And they experience something. This is, I love metaphors and different ways to teach young people things. This is a picture of a pan on my stove I think this is about 12 years ago. Historically, I get the boys up and make them breakfast. Nancy gets their lunch ready. I drive them to school. That was our pattern for many years, and now people are getting older. Still have one in high school. But one morning, I was making their breakfast, and I noticed this pan because I had started this cooking. Now, you've all seen a pan like this on your stove at some point, right? Some of you might say, "What's a stove? What's a stove?" Now, here's what's interesting about this pan. Can you see what's in that? No, you don't know what's in it. I'm the only one that knows what's in that because I put what's in that in that. It happens to be smoky links. So I have some water boiling. I put some. They were in the smoky link era at that time. They'll eat different things at different eras. And I thought, well, what a great image for what happens with young people these days. Because if you want to see what's in that pan, what do you have to do? You have to turn the heat down a little, or stir it, which actually accomplishes the same thing. It releases some of the energy in the heat. So this is a great message for young people. When it's all superheated and hot and things are moving quickly, do they see what they're getting into? No. There's no great argument here with young people except for going slower, because you can't see clearly, and that might not be a good meal. That might not be a good place for you to be. And you don't have to make it cold. You don't have to dump a load of ice in there, but you need to cool it down some to see clearly. Now, here's a great way to talk with young people. A few more comments, and then we'll take a few questions. This generation, and probably every generation for a while, in fact, most of America, is so interested in preserving their options and not making a bad choice. They're hyper interested in that, so people are very afraid to commit to anything because they don't want to give up anything and miss the chance for that better deal. Oh, I got on that train just a moment too soon. The next train was the one I wanted to be on. Okay? That's a really big deal in American culture. Here's what young people are doing in all these kinds of transitions now, the way things are happening in terms of sliding versus deciding, and also just the sequence of things. They're losing options before they make a choice. This is a really powerful way to talk with young people, because sliding causes people to lose options for the future before they even really thought about what they were doing or what they wanted. So they're losing options before making a choice. Now, notice this line at the bottom. In contrast, healthy commitment is about choosing to lose options. That's what commitment is. We are choosing to be constrained if we're actually making a real commitment. Think about that in terms of marriage, spiritual vocation other than marriage, in the church, or anything else in life. Commitment is choosing to be constrained. Sliding is becoming constrained when I didn't even know something was happening. I'm just sort of letting things happen to me. Now, some sliding's fine. When our values or belief are not undermined, nothing dangerous is at stake, nothing potentially life-altering is happening. But here's the big deal for marriage. And this is the point that I'll end on. It's this. When people, let's say it's a relatively good case in light of the culture in America these days, where somebody slides through a bunch of things but ends up in a pretty okay marriage anyway. Okay, it could have been disastrous. They could have been off here, off there. A lot of things could have gone wrong, but they end up in a pretty decent marriage. But they've slid all the way to that place. So it's not the perfect case. Here's the problem with sliding. Sliding doesn't leave somebody with the sense that I chose this. I committed to this. What sliding leads somebody to a sense of is I'm finding myself here and now it's hard, and how did I get here? I didn't choose this anyway. So what kind of commitment now does this person have when life gets a little more difficult and they have to dig a little deeper and make a sacrifice or really give something up to make this family work? If I don't have a sense of really choosing this, I have this weakened commitment now at the whole basis of this marriage. And I think what you're going to see now in this day and age, even when you see couples that are married, some number of them have one or two people in the marriage who don't have a sense that I ever really freely, totally chose this. I kind of got swept up into this. And this has tremendous implications for this whole issue that is a very powerful point in your theology about marriage in terms of the degree to which somebody really knows that they're choosing and consenting to this choice of commitment when they get married. And what I'm suggesting to you is so much in the culture now is all about sliding. The sliding puts people at risk and it undermines the formation of commitment.
This Archdiocese Today is available on home video. To place your order, call 636-0296, extension 1230. Cost for either DVD or VHS is $14.95 plus $2 shipping and handling. Or you may email video@archlu.org.